A taxi driver refuses to transport a black family, calling them a gang of monkeys and expelling them from the car. But then this happens. Stephen had always been a dedicated and resilient man, marked by a life of hard work. From a young age, he learned the importance of honesty and effort in his humble home, values he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the manager of a small local market, he was respected by everyone, always seeking to provide the best for Sandra, his wife, and Ryan, their son. For Stephen, life was a daily journey of overcoming challenges and dignity, where he always prioritized his family's well-being, regardless of the difficulties faced. Sandra, for her part, was the emotional foundation of the family. A nurse at a nearby hospital, she was known for her calmness and empathy, qualities she also applied at home. Sandra was firm in defending her family, never allowing herself to be overwhelmed by adversity. When she came home after her long shifts, she dedicated time to listen to Ryan's stories, providing a warm and nurturing learning environment. Ryan, the youngest in the house, was a curious and energetic boy, always seeking adventures. The park was his favorite place, where he ran freely and enjoyed the playground equipment with enthusiasm. For him, his parents' teachings were mixed with affection and play, creating a simple yet happy childhood. Despite the challenges of life, Stephen's family was marked by unbreakable unity. Together, they faced challenges with hope, courage, and a strong desire to build a better future. On a sunny Saturday morning, light filtered through the window of Stephen and Sandra's small kitchen, softly illuminating the space. Sandra, already awake and preparing coffee, looked at Stephen with a smile. "Today seems like a perfect day for a trip to the park, don't you think, love?" she said, finishing making Ryan's coffee. Stephen, still sleepy, rubbed his eyes and replied, "That's true, it's been a while since we had a day to relax together." "What do you think, Ryan?" Ryan, already at the table eating toast, immediately got excited. "Park. Park. Let's go, please. I want to go on the swings and see the slide again," exclaimed the boy, his eyes shining. Sandra laughed at their son's excitement and commented to Stephen, playfully, "Looks like we already have 2 votes in favor of a trip to the park." After a relaxed breakfast, the family started getting ready to go out. While packing a bag with water and snacks, Stephen asked, "Are you sure it wouldn't be easier if we had a car? We could leave whenever we wanted without having to wait for a taxi." Sandra, already familiar with this discussion, replied calmly, "Stephen, we've talked about this. I prefer this way, it's safer for us and for Ryan. Remember that time we saw that accident near our house? I just want us to be safe, without unnecessary risks." Stephen sighed but knew Sandra had good reasons. "All right then. Let's call a taxi and enjoy the day." The trip to the park was smooth. Ryan was excited, looking out the window and pointing at things he saw along the way. "Look, Dad. That's the ice cream truck," Ryan said, with his face practically glued to the glass. Stephen smiled and nodded affirmatively. Sandra, for her part, was more contemplative, watching the streets rush by while holding Ryan's hand. "I really love this park," Sandra commented, still gazing out the window. "The flowers there are always so beautiful this time of year." Stephen replied, "Yeah, it's a nice place to relax." "And you, Ryan, have you picked which ride you'll go on first?" Ryan, without hesitation, said, "On the big slide. I want to go down a lot." Sandra laughed and said, "Then we'd better prepare for a long afternoon there." At the park, the joy was immediate. Ryan ran to the slide, and Sandra, as always, was enchanted by the colorful and well-kept gardens. She stopped for a moment to admire a bed of yellow daisies, kneeling to smell the gentle fragrance of the flowers. Stephen, watching the scene, said, "You never miss a chance to admire flowers, do you?" Sandra smiled at him, as if at peace. "Flowers bring me a sense of renewal, of hope, it's always been that way." Stephen nodded silently, understanding the significance this had for Sandra. They spent the rest of the afternoon this way, alternating between playing with Ryan, who was tireless on the swings and slide, and moments of rest on park benches, enjoying the surroundings and each other's company. It was getting dark when Sandra noticed that Ryan was starting to feel sleepy after so much play. "It's time to go, love. I think Ryan has played enough for today." Stephen agreed, and together they walked to the park exit. When they reached the roadside, Sandra looked around for a taxi. "I hope it doesn't take long for one to show up," said Stephen, as Ryan leaned his tired head on his father's shoulder. Sandra, still holding Ryan's hand, spoke confidently, "One will show up soon. Let's wait a little longer." It wasn't long before a taxi finally approached. Stephen waved to the driver, and the vehicle stopped beside them. "Good evening," Stephen said, opening the taxi door for Sandra and Ryan to enter first. The driver, Brandon, merely nodded with a distant look as the family settled into the back seat. Sandra tried to break the silence, saying, "We had a great day at the park today." Stephen added, "That's right, Ryan was so happy with the rides." Ryan, half asleep, merely murmured in agreement. Brandon, however, did not respond, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead as the trip back home began. As the taxi drove through the dimly lit streets, Stephen tried to strike up a conversation again, still maintaining a polite tone. "It's always hard to find a taxi at night, isn't it? I imagine driving at this hour isn't easy." Brandon, without even turning to look at him, replied curtly, "Yeah, driving at night is complicated. I don't really know who I'm picking up. Sometimes, it's hard even to see the color of the customer." Stephen frowned, noticing the strange tone in the response, but tried to remain calm. "Well, at least we managed to find you. We're coming back from a day at the park with our son," he said, trying to steer the conversation to a lighter topic. Brandon, however, did not seem interested in easing the conversation. He let out a dry laugh and said, "Yeah, it must be nice to have time to hang out, but for people like me, it's just work. I can't afford to relax much, especially when I never know who's in the back seat." The implication was clear, and Stephen felt a growing discomfort. Sandra, noticing Brandon's tone becoming more hostile, discreetly took her phone out of her bag and started an audio recording, keeping the device hidden under her jacket. She knew something was wrong, and her protective instinct kicked in. Stephen, trying not to show the anger that was starting to bubble up, responded in a contained manner, "I understand, it's a tough job. But we're all just trying to live the best way we can, right?" It was then that Brandon dropped the subtlety. "Live? Yeah, you guys can try, but there are people who don't even deserve to be in the city, let alone in a taxi at night." Stephen fell silent for a moment, his stomach churning, as Sandra squeezed Ryan's hand to keep him calm and distracted. "Listen here, what do you mean by that?" Stephen asked, feeling the tension rise. Brandon, now more at ease to be openly offensive, responded without hesitation, "I mean, it's horrible not knowing if the person in the back seat is decent or a bunch of, people who shouldn't even be here." Stephen felt the blood rush to his face, and Sandra, beside him, controlled her breathing, focusing on recording everything. "We pay for your service like anyone else," Stephen replied, trying to maintain composure. Brandon laughed derisively, "Pay? That's just for now. People like you steal at the first chance, it's always been that way." Sandra felt a tightness in her chest, struggling not to lose control in front of Ryan, who was starting to sense that something was wrong. Stephen, now clearly indignant, retorted, "I won't accept you talking like that to my family. We are dignified people, and you have no right to treat us this way." Brandon then turned slightly, just enough to make his disdain clear. "Dignity? Where did you get that word from? Monkeys have no dignity. In fact, the safest thing for me would be to leave you hanging from some banana tree, as it should be." The comment hit Stephen like a knife, and he felt his anger boil over. "Enough. That's racism, and you'll regret talking like that," Stephen said, his voice filled with contained hatred. Brandon, instead of being intimidated, only seemed to get angrier. Racism? What a joke. People like you shouldn't even talk to me, a man of superior color. He then suddenly accelerated the car, but soon afterward slammed on the brakes at the roadside, just a few meters from an unlit area. Get out of my car now. Brandon yelled, his voice mixing hatred and superiority. I don't take people like you. Out, right now. Stephen, with his heart racing, grabbed Sandra's hand and, with a mix of outrage and despair, started to get out of the car. Sandra quickly turned off the recording and put the phone away, picking up Ryan as Brandon continued to scream racist insults from inside the taxi, as if his humiliation had no limits. People like you don't deserve even one more second here. Out! Brandon shouted, pointing to the open door with an impatient gesture. Stephen, overcome by a sense of powerlessness and anger, got out of the car along with Sandra and Ryan. As Stephen, Sandra, and Ryan exited the taxi, Brandon wasted no time in continuing to hurl insults, now louder and crueler. You think you can walk around like you're real people? People like you are all the same, and that one, he pointed at Ryan with a look of disdain, is going to end up in jail, stealing and doing what's already in his blood. That was enough for Stephen. An uncontrollable fury took hold of him, a mix of humiliation and hatred for seeing his son being the target of such a vile attack. Without thinking, he moved toward the car with quick, decisive steps. Stephen, no! Sandra shouted, holding Ryan in her arms and trying to stop him, but Stephen was already consumed by rage. In a sudden movement, Stephen reached the driver's window and grabbed Brandon by the collar of his shirt. You're going to learn to respect my family. Stephen yelled, his voice filled with a hatred he had never felt before. Brandon, still trying to free himself, responded with a sarcastic smile. People like you don't have the right to touch me, got it? You're nothing. This only fueled Stephen's anger even more, who, with a strong pull, managed to yank Brandon out of the car, throwing him hard onto the sidewalk. The fight escalated quickly. Brandon, surprisingly agile, managed to get up and retaliated with a punch that hit Stephen on the chin, making him stagger for a moment. That's what you are, violent like all the monkeys that came before you. Brandon yelled, as Stephen charged again, landing a punch to the driver's stomach, causing him to double over in pain. Stephen, completely out of control, continued to land blows on Brandon's face and body, who defended himself as best he could, trying to fend off the punches. In a desperate act, Brandon kicked Stephen's legs, nearly making him lose his balance, but Stephen quickly reacted, grabbing Brandon by the hair and pushing him back down to the ground. Stop, Stephen, please! Sandra shouted, while Ryan cried desperately, clinging to his mother's arm. Dad, stop! Dad, no! Ryan screamed, sobbing, not understanding what was happening, just feeling the terror of seeing his father act so violently. Stephen, however, seemed deaf to Sandra's pleas and his son's cries, continuing to strike Brandon, who was now on the ground, trying to shield himself with his arms. You're all the same, you don't know how to behave like people. Brandon shouted between punches, spitting words that felt like daggers. You should be in the jungle, hanging from trees, not here. The scene began to attract the attention of pedestrians, some stopping to watch, shocked by the violence of the fight. Hey, stop that, shouted a man, running to try to separate the two. Others joined in, holding Stephen's arms while he still tried to break free to land more blows on Brandon. Let him go. Let him feel what it's like to insult my son. Stephen shouted, completely distraught. Enough, man. You're going to kill him, said one of the bystanders, while Brandon, still on the ground, tried to catch his breath and let out more insults. That's right, that's how you are, violent animals. One of the pedestrians quickly called the police while others still tried to keep Stephen and Brandon separated, both visibly injured. Sandra was trying to calm Ryan, who wouldn't stop crying, not knowing how to explain what was happening. It's okay, son. Everything will be all right, she said, trying to hold back her tears. Stephen, still furious, looked at Brandon with eyes full of contempt, while Brandon continued to spit out words of hate. "See? You're nothing but an animal. A fighting monkey, like all the others." A few minutes later, the police arrived on the scene. The officers quickly approached, seeing the chaos still unfolding on the sidewalk. "What's going on here?" asked one of the officers, while another approached Stephen, trying to handcuff him. "This man attacked me out of nowhere, he was trying to rob me," Brandon shouted, his voice trembling, trying to appear as the victim in the situation. "That's not true," Stephen replied, still catching his breath. "He insulted my family the whole time, especially my son." The officers, not knowing exactly what had happened, decided to take everyone to the precinct for questioning. At the precinct, Stephen and Brandon were placed in separate rooms, while Sandra and Ryan waited in the hallway, still shaken. Stephen was called first to give his statement. "He started insulting us the moment we got into the taxi," Stephen explained to the officer, trying to stay calm. "I tried to control myself, but he started talking about my son in a way I just couldn't handle." The officer, taking notes, looked at Stephen with a serious expression. "I understand you were upset, but physical violence isn't the answer, sir," the officer said. Stephen lowered his head, still grappling with guilt and anger. When it was Brandon's turn, his version was completely different. "I was just driving when this man started attacking me for no reason," Brandon said, with a tone of false innocence. "I thought he was going to rob me, he looked like a savage." The officer, now with a more skeptical look, continued to hear Brandon's version, which insisted on denying any provocation. "I was just doing my job, and he attacked me out of nowhere." Finally, Sandra was called to give her statement. "He was racist from the beginning, using subtle insults, then direct ones," she said, her voice steady despite her evident fatigue. "When he mentioned my son in an offensive way, Stephen lost control. But I recorded everything." Sandra showed the audio recording on her phone to the officer, who listened attentively. Brandon's words in the recording were clear and brutal, confirming what Sandra and Stephen had reported. The officer, surprised by the evidence, said, "This changes everything. Brandon will be held for racist conduct, and the case will go to trial. You may go home now." Stephen, Sandra, and Ryan were finally released, leaving the precinct still marked by the brutality of the event. Brandon, on the other hand, remained in custody, now facing charges of racism. Stephen's family left the location in silence, the weight of what had happened still evident on their faces, while Sandra tried to comfort Ryan, who was still quietly sobbing. A few days after the incident, Stephen and Sandra's house seemed enveloped in a silent tension. The family's routine was marked by the recent trauma, and even Ryan, usually cheerful, seemed quieter. In the midst of this atmosphere of apprehension, a firm knock on the door interrupted the silence. When Stephen opened the door, he found a court officer holding a thick envelope in one hand. "Mr. Stephen?" the officer asked. "Yes, that's me," Stephen replied, confused. The officer handed him the document and explained, "The trial is scheduled for next week. You must appear in court on the date and time indicated here." Stephen, worried, quickly asked, "And what about Brandon? Is he still in jail?" The officer paused briefly before responding, "No, he was released on bail. His family paid for him to await trial at home." Stephen felt a mix of frustration and anger, but he composed himself. "Thank you for the information," he said as the officer bid farewell and left the house. Closing the door, Stephen returned to the living room where Sandra and Ryan were waiting for him, both attentive and worried. "The trial has a date," he said, showing the envelope to Sandra. "And Brandon has already been released." Sandra, holding Ryan's hand, looked at Stephen with a determined expression. "We can't face this alone, Stephen. We need a lawyer, someone who knows how to handle this kind of situation." Stephen agreed, knowing it was the best course of action. "I'll call my dad. He knows a lawyer who can help us. Sandra nodded, and Stephen grabbed the phone, quickly dialing his father's number. "Hello, Dad," Stephen said when his father answered. "Stephen. What's happening, son? You sound nervous," his father replied, his voice laden with concern. Stephen quickly explained what had happened. "I was verbally attacked by a racist taxi driver, and I ended up losing control. Now we're being taken to trial, and I need a lawyer." His father, understanding, offered some quick advice. "I get it, son. It's a tough situation, but you did what you thought was right to protect your family. I know a good lawyer, his name is Patrick Herrera. I'll give you his number." Stephen wrote down the contact and thanked him. "Thank you, Dad. I'll call him right now." Stephen then called Patrick Herrera, the lawyer recommended by his father. "Hello, is this Mr. Patrick Herrera?" Stephen asked upon hearing the voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, who's this?" the lawyer responded, in a professional tone. Stephen quickly explained what had happened and the impending trial. Patrick, showing understanding and interest, said, "We can meet this afternoon at my office. I'll review the case with you and your wife to understand better what happened." Stephen thanked him again and hung up the phone. That afternoon, Stephen and Sandra left Ryan with a trusted neighbor and went to the lawyer's office. Patrick greeted them with a firm handshake and an attentive look. "Please, have a seat," he said, indicating the chairs in front of his desk. Stephen began to recount the incident in detail, from the initial offenses to the moment of the fight on the street. "I have an audio recording of Brandon's offenses," Sandra added, showing the phone to the lawyer. Patrick listened intently, taking notes and occasionally interrupting to ask for more details. "This is clearly a case of racism, no doubt," Patrick said after hearing the recording. "However, I need to be honest with you. Stephen, the fact that you acted violently complicates things. You may also face penalties." Stephen looked surprised, but Patrick continued, "With the evidence we have, I believe Brandon will be convicted of racism, but it's likely you'll have to pay some compensation for the physical assault." Sandra squeezed Stephen's hand, trying to convey calm. "We're prepared for the consequences," she said firmly. After hearing everything, Stephen looked at Patrick and said, "We need your help. We're willing to hire your services to represent us in the trial." Patrick nodded and explained the next steps in the process, assuring them he would do everything possible to achieve justice for the family. On the day of the trial, the tension was palpable. Stephen and Sandra arrived at the courthouse accompanied by Patrick, while Ryan stayed with the same neighbor. Upon entering the courtroom, they saw Brandon already seated next to his lawyer, wearing a serious expression, yet still carrying the same air of superiority he had shown during the incident. Stephen sat beside Patrick, who advised him to stay calm throughout the process. The judge began the trial, first calling Stephen to give his testimony. Stephen recounted his version of events, detailing Brandon's insults and the uncontrolled reaction he had when hearing the insults directed at Ryan. "I lost control when he insulted my son so cruelly. I'm not proud of what I did, but I was trying to protect my family," Stephen said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Next was Sandra's turn, who confirmed every detail of Stephen's account and presented the recording as evidence. The recording was played in complete silence in the courtroom, leaving everyone visibly shocked, including the judge. Brandon was called to give his testimony. He continued to insist on the version that he was merely defending himself from an unexpected attack, claiming he feared for his life. "He started attacking me for no reason, and I thought he was going to rob me," Brandon stated, trying to maintain a victim's demeanor. Stephen's lawyer, however, aggressively questioned him about the racist comments recorded in the audio. "Can you explain those words? How does that fit into a situation of self-defense?" Patrick asked incisively. Brandon hesitated but ultimately responded evasively, "I was nervous, I didn't think before speaking." The judge also called several pedestrians who had witnessed the fight. While many of them didn't know the details of how the conflict began, several confirmed that Brandon continued to hurl racist insults while on the ground, even when Stephen was already being restrained by others. "He was clearly trying to provoke even more," said one of the pedestrians. Another testified, "His words were horrible, it wasn't just any fight. He was being cruel on purpose." After the testimonies, the judge paused before delivering the final verdict. Brandon is convicted of racism and will have to serve 2 years of house arrest, in addition to paying a significant fine to Stephen's family. However, Stephen will also be penalized, needing to pay compensation for the physical assault. Brandon, with a look of despair, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and Brandon nodded, frustrated. When the trial concluded, Patrick informed Stephen and Sandra that Brandon would have to sell his taxi and other belongings to pay the fine. "It seems justice has been served, but the price was high for everyone," Patrick said as they walked out of the courthouse. Stephen, with a tired look, turned to Sandra and said, "I don't know if this brings peace, but at least we know we didn't let what he did to our family go unpunished." As they returned home, Stephen hugged Ryan tightly, feeling a mix of relief and sadness for what they had to face. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.